Good morning, everybody. My name is Noel Lindsay, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor Entrepreneurship and Dean of Business at the Adelaide Business School at the University of Adelaide. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the AmCham Australia, the Business of Wine Part 1 webinar, partnered with Adelaide Business School. A couple of Zoom housekeeping notes first. Please type any questions you may have throughout the presentation in the Q&A section, which is located on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen, and the speakers will be happy to answer your questions. This webinar is also being recorded and is available for viewing on the AmCham member website. I'd now like to introduce you to our speakers, and we have 5 distinguished speakers this morning. First up, we have Andreas Clark. Andreas is the Chief Executive Officer of Wine Australia and has led Wine Australia since its inception on the 1st of July 2014. Prior to that, Andreas held a number of senior management roles with the former Wine Australia Corporation. Before joining the wine sector, Andreas served as a diplomat with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra and then Brunei, and has also worked as a lawyer in private practice and in-house with an ASX-listed company. Next, we have Rebecca Hopkins. Rebecca is the Vice President, Communications and Partner for Folio Fine Wine Partners, a national wine importer, sales and marketing agency based in Napa, California. With more than 25 years wine marketing experience, Rebecca has been in San Francisco for the last 13 years, working in-house in communications for both large corporate and small wine producers. An experienced wine communications strategist, Rebecca's work with Folio spans media relations, trade and influencer marketing, event activation, and supplier relations. Kathy Marlin. Kathy is the Senior Vice President and General Manager, Negociants USA and Winebow Imports. Kathy, as you will see, is one of the most dynamic and accomplished female executives in the US wine business, with an already dense catalogue of experience spanning importing and distribution, brand development, strategic planning, and public relations. At Negociants USA, Kathy oversees the leading collection of Australian, New Zealand, and South African wine sold in the US, and occupies a crucial role in one of the largest distribution and leading premium import companies in the United States. Next, we have Justin Dry. Justin is an entrepreneur, investor, and co-founder and CEO of Inomofo, one of Australia's fastest growing companies. Launched in April 2011 from a little garage here in Adelaide, Inomofo now operates in Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, with an impressive number of startup business awards. And then finally, we have Damien Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the inaugural Hamill Family Chair of Wine Business Education with Sonoma State University Wine Business Institute. Dr. Wilson arrived in California in 2015 with 20 years of professional experience in the wine sector. I'm now going to hand over to Damien, and who's going to lead the panel presentation. Over to you, Damien.
Thank you very much, Pro-Vice Chancellor, and what a pleasure and honour it is to be involved in this discussion on behalf of everyone who's put this together, the American Chamber of Commerce, Wine Australia, and all of the attendees. So I'm not going to take up much of your time today. My role as the moderator is literally just to look at the Q&A and to keep the discussion going. So you're probably sitting there thinking, what are we going to talk about today? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's just have a look at what I've put together just as a means to show what the topics of discussion are going to be for today. So literally, we're going to talk about 5 key issues which we're planning to cover for everyone. Starting with the pandemic impacts on the Australia-US wine business, a key part of the charge of the American Chamber of Commerce, the Australian wine export market, and looking at issues about dispelling the myths. What we're starting to see is the difference between what we're hearing and what's actually happening. Focusing on Australian wine's reputation and the direction across global markets. Adapting to the needs of the social media era, the digital communications and e-commerce as a solution and saviour. And I dare say we'll talk about things such as virtual tastings. And certainly as an Australian who has been living in the US now for the last 5 years, I've certainly noticed those cultural differences. It's just the little things that you don't sort of pick up on if you don't have the experience of, say, living in a country such as the US. And not least of which are the things that most notably you would overlook them if you didn't know any differently. Just like when you introduce yourself in the United States, it's important at the start of a presentation to do something like to make a point of presenting something that you've done recently, like an article that received more than 5,000 views on the first day, or talking about some sort of success story you've had with a case study with regard to the adoption of screw caps and how that's been popular across 7 different continents, or sorry, 7 different countries. But I'm not going to do something like that because as an Australian, that's not what we do. People who do that sort of thing as Australians, they're kind of regarded as pretentious wankers. And that's not what we're trying to do or what we're trying to communicate as Australians. We want to be able to both communicate our culture, what makes us valued and valuable as both who are involved in the session, but also as people who are helping that exchange in the relationship across national boundaries. So I will take this opportunity to start the discussion, and we'll hand over to the CEO of Wine Australia, Andreas Clark, to talk about that key issue, the impact about the pandemic on the Australia-US exchange and trade in wine business, and I will make my point to monitor the Q&A. I'm going to sit here in the background, I'm going to turn off my video, and I'll click back in when it's time for me to take over and hand over the discussion to someone else. Over to you, Andreas.
Thanks, Damien. Great to be with you all. And yeah, look, I'll just make a few sort of introductory comments to get the ball rolling. It's you know, needless to say, it's been a pretty fluid and dynamic period of time recently, and we're all collectively trying to sort of navigate what's happening and the pathway ahead, and I guess synthesise all that information to understand what it means for the Australian wine category generally, both domestically and exports. I mean, it's such a complex web, isn't it, as we all know, and we also appreciate that there's such a spread of wine businesses across the country with a different focus and a different emphasis. At a Wine Australia level, we generally talk principally around export and export markets, but obviously there's many players who their key focus is domestic, whether it's domestic retail, direct to consumer, whereas the tourism nexus and that opportunity that sits with them. So it's hard to speak for all businesses at a very general level. But I guess from our end, as I said, I'll focus, given, you know, we're talking about, you know, the US, it's the Chamber of Commerce, I'll direct sort of a lot of my comments around sort of from an export perspective, particularly with the US, but hopefully put in a bit of a broader picture as well. So, I mean, what we've seen, obviously, over the last, you know, 4 to 5 years, we've had a, you know, really solid run from the export story. You know, and you go back further than that, again, to put a bit of context, many of you on the line will be very familiar with this, but for those who aren't, you know, the Australian export story was, you know, rocketing along, hit a peak of, in, you know, the mid-2000s of about $3 billion of exports. Then a whole host of headwinds and challenges present themselves, and the export story dropped off to, you know, about 1.8 billion in Aussie dollars or thereabouts. We're now back up to around sort of 2.85 billion dollars. We've seen the rise of China, and you know, it's gone from a $100 million market to a $1 billion market over that period of time. We've seen a drop off in those traditional markets of the UK and the US. So that's sort of the scene that has played out. You know, during the fast forwarding to the, you know, the last few months, what we've seen immediately is, you know, a pretty immediate drop off in the first instance in China. And I mean, there was such a run up in exports into China. It's been such a strong market, but you know, that export growth has been very significant. So there was always going to be a natural sort of tailing off, and I guess the impact of the arrival of COVID-19 and seen foremost in China, created that very, very strong headwind into the exports in China. So things did really slow up pretty quickly there. Things have picked up though back into China over the last couple of months, but we've certainly seen a drop off in exports into China over the last 3 to 4 months. At the same time though, you look at sort of the quarter ending the end of May, we've seen an uplift in a number of other markets. UK's had double-digit growth, strong growth into Canada, and we have seen growth back into the US. I'm looking through the export figure Prism, and we're seeing strong growth, particularly at above $5 FOB and above $10 FOB. So it is very volatile. We are seeing some interesting shifts at the moment, but it's a moving feast every month. You've sort of got to look at it and understand what's playing out. I mean, I'll finish off, I guess, the opening comments. The key thing that I've heard throughout the duration of this is the absolute importance, and we all know it in business, of diversification. And that's diversification via market, obviously, but also particularly for where we're at with the wine segment, by channel as well. We've seen the impact of the restaurant scene, obviously, and what's been felt there. So those businesses who have had a spread of markets, a spread of channels, have been in obviously a much better stead and a more durable long-term position to sort of navigate their way through what is pretty uncertain and challenging times. So look, I'll park it there, Damien, in terms of some opening comments, and I'll leave it to you.
All right, thanks very much for that, Andreas. I'll hand over in a second to Kathy Marlin, because her background is, she's pretty much got the feet on the ground with what's happening in the US market, specifically with Australian wine. So given what you just said about the perception of China as a key market and the focus here about talking about what's happening in the US, Kathy, can you tell us a little bit about what's happened there and indeed what we could be doing to remedy the situation or the impacts of the pandemic?
Yes, well, thank you everyone for having me on here. I think what Andreas has mentioned is incredibly important. We have seen some resurgence for Australia, and I think it's important to talk about the lead up to the pandemic as a really strong period of time for the Australian category in the United States. On the one hand, unfortunately, a number of the the customers and the people that were engaged and really excited ambassadors to take the wines and the messages of Australia to the marketplace going forward are in a pretty difficult situation right now. There's a lot of them that are out of work. Some of those businesses that are shut down, whether it's temporary or permanent at this point. And unfortunately, I cannot say that the US is on the better side of the pandemic at this point. So I think when we talk about opportunities and we talk about what can be done, we need to look at today. We need to look, at the next 6 to 12 months as being part of the current situation. And, that is really going to shape the future. And we're in the midst of that right now. And so what I'll comment on is that there really are 3 areas that we're seeing growth for the Australian category and for many categories. E-commerce is one that I know we're going to talk through probably a few times with the lead horse of wine.com. The great success that they've had is somewhat overnight, although they've been operating for 20 years. It's a company that really has, laid the foundation correctly for this exact situation to come to pass. And they are showing that in their sales results. So I'm sure many people have seen the news around that, but just for an Australian tidbit, the business with wine.com in May and June was up over 200% inside those 2 months over the previous year. And their business, my business is quadruple what it was 3 months ago. So for our Australian wines. The great thing about wine.com and other e-commerce is that it's not necessarily concentrated to mainstream brands, there's an opportunity there to present your entire portfolio. There's a lot of work that goes behind that with working with that account, but it is a big opportunity to get breadth and depth of your portfolio and your brand to the market. And they ship to, almost all states at this point in some way or another. The other opportunity that has emerged that is an area of growth is club business for imports. So specifically, I'm not talking Costco big chain clubs. I'm talking about wine clubs. And if you know something about the US market, there's a massive direct-to-consumer DTC business that happens for the California wineries and Oregon wineries that really has been an area untouched for imports. And slowly in the last 5 years, it's become more and more open and available as people get more sophisticated about how to move wine around the country and how to sell to people through an online channel. And that has really taken off as well during the pandemic. So I think there's a lot of growth in their area, customers like Wine Access. And the last piece is the one that I think is a global response to the pandemic, which is just major retail selling very reputable, widely distributed brands that people trust and that they've already been purchasing. And that stocking up has been happening. March sales were incredibly strong. April, in retail specifically, April held its own, and May had another, surge of business. So those are the three areas where I think there's, growth and opportunity in the next 6 to 12 months for suppliers and others that are in the marketplace. And the key price points really between $10 and $15, which matches what Andreas was mentioning before. So that is that premiumization opportunity for Australia and the next step.
Thanks for that, Kathy. I think that's really the silver lining in the cloud, which I think a lot of people are looking at the moment when it's been quite difficult. And I think I'll turn to Rebecca Hopkins now. And Rebecca, you manage quite an extensive portfolio of wines that you're bringing into the country. Working on Oz at this point in time, where do you see that change in the market, the prospect for premiumization, or indeed what the wine.com model is doing with virtual tastings? Is there a lead-in or an opening for Australian wine, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks, Damien. And I would say, much like what Kathy said about the growth of wine.com as a channel, we certainly see that at Folio. Folio doesn't actually, we don't have any New Zealand or Australian producers in our book. The majority of our book is traditional Europe producing regions. And I would say that we're certainly still seeing very similar trends. So the wine.com trend for us, absolutely. The DTC club business, e-commerce, absolutely. But I think really, and kind of third point, the collapse of the on-trade market is very much affecting trial, brand awareness, and really what I think many of us have relied on for that one-on-one sale opportunity. I would say the other compounding issue with communications is the entire collapse of the media industry. Traditional media is really in free fall. And so not only do we have an industry in, challenging times, but we have really the breakdown of what has traditionally been a very powerful means of getting brands to market through traditional media, whether that's through critics, through writers, through advertising, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the opportunity for Australia, while we have these really big, issues that are facing our industry, we have tremendous opportunity because what's coming out of this is all new media opportunities for brands to connect directly with gatekeepers, influencers, buyers, distributors through this exact medium we're on now, digital and online media and marketing. And so what is coming out of that is some pretty exciting ways that brands that maybe traditionally haven't been able to reach these opinion leaders or connect with, these influencers are really, those barriers have gone, because now it really comes down to share of mind and share of space and, getting your seat at the table to start to position your brand well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Beck. I think that's that really kind of leads into a topic I'd like to Justin to comment on. Specifically, Justin's created, just this little wine distribution company that some of you may have heard of. That's pretty much had things its own way in the digital sphere. Perhaps not its own way, but there's been a decided lack of competition in the use of digital as a communication and distribution medium. And so, Justin, what do you see? How do you see that Vinomofo in particular has been able to take advantage of that? And what do you think now with the rest of the competition hot on your heels now? I'm trying to catch up with with how to take advantage of the digital sphere.
Hey guys, great to be here. First of all, thank you for the question. Thank you for having me. Look, it's been a pretty transformational period of time for our industry and for Vinomofo in itself. I mean, we saw as Beck mentioned, the collapse of on-premise in Australia. Online adoption has accelerated. Most believe, 3 to 5 years ahead in time. We've certainly seen that restaurants are closed, or if they are open, they're restricted in numbers. People are being more cautious around health concerns, so staying in. People are avoiding crowded places. So the shopping's becoming a much more preferred choice. And this behavior, I think a lot of people have thought that it might be short term. And I think the patterns that it's creating are long term. It's behavioral change. And while I think some will kind of return to the old ways, I think a fair chunk of the people that are trying online for the first time, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a bunch of people. It's not just people ordering more because they're stuck at home. It's a whole bunch of people that previously may have, there may have been hurdles in front of them to try the channel. They're being brought down and they're testing it. And once they try it, they're adopting to it and they're staying on. And I think, I think in that way, it's been a fundamental shift in the way people are buying wine. And so I don't think this is going to be reverting back to normal. It's going to be a new normal going forward. And, and I think online has become even more important than it was 6 months ago. I mean, and I think the people that have spent the time and energy building those direct to consumer channels, you're starting to see that they're really getting the benefit from that. And the people that haven't are running a million miles an hour to build it as they go. Our business is made up of a few different businesses within the one business. And you've got the online channel, which is Vinomofo. You've got another part of the business, which is something that's growing really fast at the moment, and that's called Vino Direct. And that is basically helping wineries build their direct to consumer channels. And one of those ways is obviously by phone. The other way is online through email or text messaging, and that part of the business is currently growing 100% year on year for us, and that's off a big number. The rest of the business, and that's us not approaching anyone. That is inbound business, because wineries are all scrambling a million miles an hour to start to build up this channel that is now crucial. And so, that part of the business is really, really, really fast growing. The online channel obviously is growing super fast. We've grown probably 50 to 70% this year alone. And that's, again, off a pretty large number. So the change we're seeing is huge. And I think it's here to stay in a big way.
Thanks, Justin. I wanted to come back to something that you said earlier about the digital and people coming into the medium. And I just want to ask Andreas to go back to you and get you to comment in a second on this whole issue about how difficult it is for wine producers. What are you hearing about them getting involved in digital? Whilst I'll get the rest of you to focus on Fred Chilton's question, I'll turn back to that afterwards. But first to Andreas, could you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing on the ground from the industry about the challenges in having to adapt to digital?
Look, I think, to Justin's point, people have had to move very quickly. And some have been better prepared than others, obviously. But yeah, look, yeah, I think one of the hallmarks of the sector is pretty adaptable and pretty resilient. And you know, people can all sort of what was me, or get on and run with it. And that's what I've seen. People have just jumped on board, and there's you know, some great examples locally where, you know, I'm on lots of I subscribe to a whole bunch of producers and get their material in, and I've been pretty impressed with the way people have just jumped on board and moved with the times. So you know, they're pretty nimble businesses, and you know, the wine sector, obviously we have some of the bigger companies and medium ones, but there's a whole bunch of smaller ones who you know, have to juggle many balls. And yeah, I've been pretty impressed by the way they've just got up and run with it, and they've had to. You know, back you know, I guess back into the US or other markets, you know, we're doing a lot from a Wine Australia perspective, obviously through digital, in terms of just our engagement, and I guess consistently sowing the seed and representing what the category is all about. And one of our primary focuses through that is through education. I mean, the wine game is a complicated one for the consumer, and anything we can do to help demystify it and help build a bridge and a relevant connection with the consumer, so that they can navigate their way through what wine is all about, particularly Australian wine. So one of the great sort of building blocks we've got at the moment is a platform, Australian Wine Discovered. So with courtesy of the extra funding we got from the government over the last few years, we've been able to put a lot of money into building this online sort of library of modules which talk through region, talk through style, variety, etc., in a really accessible way. And so we've really put the foot to the pedal over the last 6 months and pushing that out through our digital means. And there's plenty of people out there who, you know, have got time on their hands in the on-trade, so you know, they've been lapping it up. And you know, they'll emerge somewhere, and you know, we wish them all the best. And you know, we'll have them on board as ambassadors for the sector. So yeah, I mean, overall, I think we do an okay job. But you know, it just requires diligence and application, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. That can-do attitude is certainly something that comes through from the Australian perspective, and certainly what we're regarded for in the US. And I'll turn to Kathy first to talk about, because she's probably more familiar with this, with the wine.com and the experiences. And I just wanted to reiterate a point I heard about their new customers. Based on the pandemic, more than a third of the customers they got in the first month after the pandemic affected sales were all new customers. So people are kind of driven to that medium. So what does that mean with the growth of things like virtual tastings, Kathy? When we're looking at Fred's question showing United Cellars have held some very successful series of virtual tastings via Zoom, including Italian winemakers and their English MW advisor. By a case of 12, 3 showcased each week from different regions over 4 weeks. Can a similar approach for Australian wines work in the US? What do you think, Kathy?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely nothing preventing us from doing something like that. And in fact, many producers and importers and distributors have been engaging in these types of things. There are obviously, almost to the second point, the second question that Fred is asking, you know, there are definitely state restrictions that make it very difficult to do widespread, campaigns in this way. There's also state level regulations of what you can and cannot promote through retail channels. The example of wine.com, interestingly, even though they've retained a bunch of new customers to their site, they haven't been getting them through the same marketing tactics that they had been previously using. So they're not finding that offering discount codes and some of the things that have been successful previously are actually bringing the new customers into the mix. We took part with them. They're very good at collaborating, and it's in different regions and different areas, Zoom tastings. One example is we partnered with a top 40 under 40 from Wine Enthusiast who has a yoga studio and is also trying to marry yoga and wine. We did what was called a Vino Vinyasa evening, and we had a discount code with wine.com to purchase the wine in advance and then go through a yoga session and have a tasting post. Now, there was enormously great engagement by people, but not a lot of wine sales. So even though people took part in the event, they actually didn't get enticed by having a discount code to wine.com to go and take that new, if they hadn't been a previous customer, go in and actually go through the process of learning how to buy wine in that way. So it is something that is actually somewhat undiscovered and misunderstood even by some of the wine.com people, where, there is no real answer formulated yet. This is an interesting time. We're only, 3 months into this, and I think they're still collecting data to understand how they're actually pulling in new customers. But at the end of the day, wine.com is likely the first thing you plug into your web browser when you're looking to buy wine online, and that's probably got a lot of that in it. So yes, those events are possible. It's probably more realistic from a customer level that it would be one wine and a Zoom tasting at a certain time, and wine.com does a lot of celebrity ones at the moment. But it's also possible for an importer or a retailer to take that initiative as well. So there's a lot of innovation happening in this area. I think the big question is, how do you retain people's interest in being on Zoom calls constantly? And what is it about, getting 1,000 people or 100 people that are incredibly engaged? What's the difference? I think we learned a lot through social media and the way that we talk to people that way. And I think we're learning much quicker that the numbers game isn't necessarily the only way to go and the best way to actually have it impact and have a commercial output. So
yeah, thanks for that, Kathy. And certainly with the evolving nature of the virtual tastings, I've been through some which are incredibly interesting and some which it beggars belief that they even thought that was a concept. So I think getting the balance right is important. So Beck, what have you seen? You've been patiently sitting there with your mic open. Let's hear from you on this topic.
Well, I think certainly what Kathy's speaking to is absolutely true. And I would say to Fred's question, there's a big difference between brand virtual tastings and regional virtual tastings. And, we also have the added challenge in the US of inventory management, which when you're starting to think about, hosting brand specific activity, you better be really close to your importer and understand your inventory that's going to be in market, because having also done tastings with wine.com, there can be potential for great results and great engagement and great stories, and there can also be potential for disappointed people who maybe haven't received maybe what they'd signed up for. You need good talent. It's just a fact. When people are on camera, you're already losing part of that personality. And so, Zoom tastings can be incredibly powerful. They bring stories to life. They bring faces to names and to wines. But again, at the end of the day, the liquid in your glass is probably one of 3 predominant colors. And so you really need to make sure that the content you're delivering has a lot more richness than, possibly what you could have done either, one-on-one or through a visit, a recommendation from a sommelier or from a wine director. We will always have challenges with shipping, with logistics. There is plenty of creative people with creative ways to get around receiving wine. Not all illegal. So it's really important that people really also understand, what is possible to manage that expectation around, getting those tastings complete, and then just Zoom fatigue is real.
And just on that note, I can call Justin in on this point, because this is pretty much his sphere as far as the digital realm is concerned. Justin, what are you thinking about the idea of virtual tastings? What role does it play with you, and perhaps even looking to expand into the US?
Yeah, look, there's never been a time in my mind to build an audience at scale through this channel. People are looking to do things online. They're stuck in homes. They're more open to it. They're the way they handle their business and their family relationships now, and the use of this channel has grown so significantly that there's an opportunity. It's huge, I think. You've got to give consideration to who your audience is and what style of engagement they like. But the other thing is, there's this thought that it has to lead to transaction to be valuable, and it's the wrong way around. You've got to build an audience that you deeply engage with, and then over time, kind of look for a transaction, not here, not next week, not in whatever period of time frame that makes it a success based on that one interaction. The able to build the relationship, the ability to have people coming to visit your website or your channel and then re-engage with them over a period of time is tremendously valuable. So I think, yes, fatigue is real. I mean, I'm getting sick of all the meetings I have through Zoom at the moment, but the intense. I'm finding it really, really valuable because the level of concentration and engagement that you get in this channel is amazing. I find even my meetings are they're far more productive. Two, because everyone's focusing on it. But it's all in. You're very involved in the moment when you're doing these things. So yes, fatigue is real, but the opportunity is massive. And three, just don't think about it as a transactional environment in the moment, and build that engagement and that relationship and that community over time, and the value comes.
I think that's a great point. The fact that we know from research that it's important to both look at the brand building and audience interaction, focus on it before the triggering sales element of it. And I think that's a message which should resonate with everyone in the audience here. You don't try and make a sale on your first pitch. That's pretty much the bottom line. So I wanted to move on to the next question, because I think another question from Fred. I'm concerned Fred's sitting there with his questions lined up and typing them all in one after another as we get to them. Anyone else who wants to ask a question, please feel free to put them in. We certainly won't bite, and we want to hear from what are the issues that are of importance to you. With regard to the whole issue of shipping wine into the US, just as someone who was here, I was really surprised when Danny Brager from Nielsen put up online and was explaining that this whole issue of selling takeaways at restaurants, so having an off-premise option to on-premise sales, has been illegal across the country until the current situation. And the rules are really up in the air at the moment about what people are familiar with, what they can do, and whether and what and how much they can ship across states. So this is really keeping up to date with that is a challenge. And I'll go back to Andreas on this one, and just to ask that question, what is it that the wine industry in Australia knows about shipping laws in the US, and what sort of questions are they asking you about them at this point in time?
Well, that's where we throw to the experts such as Kathy. I think probably a much better place to give a response to this. I mean, it's hard. The US, at a very high level, it's not one country. It's from a wine perspective or an alcohol perspective, we're talking about it being 50 countries in one in terms of each state, and relying on your in-market partners to help you navigate all of those challenges. Kathy, I reckon you're best placed to jump in to talk about the lay of the land, because you're very close to talk the knowledge.
I guess the overarching thing I would say is that as the stated expert, it's so confusing. It's difficult to keep on top of, to be honest. It is the country is led at a state level, at a county level. You still have dry counties inside states. You have state regulations. You have different, pricing protocols. You have controlled margin return to various tiers within the system. The thing to say is that it's not going to change. That is the U.S. market. There are opportunities that are presented within that. And really being able to look at, a national view and have a strategy is great. You need to also be able to be very flexible and adapt with the host of different things that happen at a state level. The sales tax component, which if I'm understanding that question correctly, shipping DTC is more a legal shipping, restraint that people have. And that's why I mentioned earlier, wine.com is, the 100-pound gorilla, because they've been doing it for 20 years. If someone decided yesterday they wanted to set up a warehouse and start shipping wine all over the US. They would have a lot of paperwork to get through to make that actually a reality, so much so that it would be a deterrent. But in terms of the state sales tax, yes, every state has a different sales tax. That means your pricing, your national pricing strategy can't effectively be national. And that's where you sort of have to collaborate with your importers, your distributors, to try and smooth the lines as best as possible, so you can be working with national customers or being able to ship wines nationally. Again, it all rolls back up to a lot of time and care and effort in behind to make sure that your brand is seen appropriately in the marketplace. And there's a lot of examples, unfortunately, of markets that take the sales tax advantage and damage your brand. And your customer these days on Wine Searcher your customer is everyone. It's not the guy next door. It's a global position that you need to take for your brand. So it's an incredibly important and very challenging thing to navigate in the US.
Yeah, certainly the regulations and the different levels, the whole concept of federal, state, and local really does make it a bit of a minefield. So it's probably opening a can of worms. So I was going to say focus on the experts in that area, and Kathy would be very happy to point you towards those. I'm sure Rebecca may have a comment on that, but I actually also want to get your perspective on a question from Andrew. Beck, you may know more about this. His question is that, are you seeing a move to buy local with the US consumer, as I'm seeing in Oz with with US wineries?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking in terms of physical transaction shift, I would say it's coming down more to availability at shelf, if we're seeing that much of a shift. I mean, Kathy's portfolio is far more active, obviously, in imports, but we are seeing, we do have a very strong domestic portfolio. That portfolio is performing, but we're not seeing switching from imports to domestic. I think I will say though, we are definitely seeing American consumers resort to national brands they know and trust. And I would say that kind of weekday drinking, is consistently showing us that it is, if they're not the intrepid explorer and looking to taste new wines, if they just want wine in their fridge for 5 o'clock, certainly the big growth we're seeing, and you have these numbers as well, but are in those domestic, strong national brands, that consumers have known. Kendall Jackson, Woodbridge, Robert Mondavi. And also we're seeing, volume buys of domestic product, right? So 2 litre, 3 litre, 5 litre, so larger format purchase. But in terms of, we don't have any data if that shift is coming from the imported category into domestics.
And so, Justin, on that note, I mean, you're contemplating getting into the US market. How do those numbers impact your approach to the strategy? Does it affect the timing? Does it affect the volume? Does it affect something else that doesn't come to mind at the moment?
We have looked at the US market a couple of times, and one, we were very close to launching there. We've spent it is complicated. I've spent a lot of time over there and chatting to experts in all the fields, and I don't know, look, we'll get there at some point, but there's been one particular time that we were very close to getting there. So I did get to understand the market extremely well compared to what I did before, and we were going to be based out of California, which is where most people set up, and the restrictions around states you could ship to, I think we were able to get into 13 initially, and then have to work out partnerships to get up to 35. Obviously there's software that you can use that helps simplify the complications, but it's all at margin. So yeah, look, it's an exciting market because it's huge. It's massive. The price point for Australian wine there's interesting and challenging, but obviously there's opportunity to increase that. So we've found it fascinating, but at the moment we've focused on Southeast Asia, and there's opportunities there. And that was probably our next move, was another market into Southeast Asia, until COVID hit, and that's kind of put those plans on hold for a period of time. And we're focusing very much domestically at the moment, and the markets that we've established. Singapore's doing incredibly well for us, and so that's why we're continuing down that path. Growth markets as compared to a big monster, and that is complicated. But I tell you what, just from pure size, it's fascinating. But touching back onto the buy local thing, we're certainly seeing it in Australia. And there's an added complexity to shipping wine now. It's taking longer. It's more expensive from global markets for us. So we're definitely seeing it come at us in two ways. One, the speed and expense of international, and two, the market is supporting local, and we've seen that in our numbers.
And so, Kathy, I'll turn to you on this one. Given that turn to local, and we don't know, we'd be interested to hear what it's like in the US if you're seeing the same thing, but also if the changes that are taking place in the US market, what advice would you give to Australian wine producers who are considering exporting or who are considering perhaps expanding their portfolio to have more success in the US market?
Okay, well, to tackle that question, I think, it's incredibly important to look at the long-term game plan. I think there's a number of imported wineries from all over the world that, look to dip a toe in the United States and think that that's kind of the beginning of a foundation. And in a number of ways, and in a lot of the online channels where you can get in at a state level, that can somewhat prevent you from looking at a broader scope in the marketplace going forward. So I think, the biggest piece of advice is to have a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve, whether it's volume, whether it's, global brand positioning, what type of customer you're looking for, and to stick with that sort of umbrella strategy as you navigate your way through entering the market. It's not a secret that it is very challenging to get in. There's a bottleneck in distribution. With the, all of the large distribution companies, preventing additional and expanded portfolios from their importers. And so importers are, have a really challenging time sitting in front of a supplier and saying, we would love to work with you and we'll be able to get the job done since we have, other partners that we need to collaborate with. But yeah, back to the main point, really, I would say just make sure that you're clear about your strategy, because I've had a number of discussions with people where I would be really interested in their brand, but they've been selling in a market, at cost +5 through an online retailer, not realizing that that's damaged their price position and their branding. And it's very difficult to recover from that when you're looking to expand out to national. And there's nothing wrong with going in at a state level if that's what your strategy is and what you're looking to accomplish in the marketplace. But it's just important to know that and to stick to that despite some of those one-off opportunities you might get.
And I'll go back to you for the next question from Milan as well, because you mentioned the kind of importing light, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. And Milan's question on how do Australian wineries deliver single cases of wine into the US from online orders, considering the need for permits, etc. Are there agents that can help with this? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that question means they're purchasing online at the winery website and they're trying to deliver it internationally. If I'm taking that question wrong, I apologize. But that's a very complicated situation. The best thing to do, and there are companies that have set themselves up to be the sort of the joining point for cellar doors in Australia for certain, and all over the world. But they will actually promote your brand online and ask people to buy the brand from that online retailer as opposed to buying it from the winery direct. Because you're going to run into the same challenge you would run into if you hopped on a plane and tried to get off the other end with a case of wine. The customs, all of the clearance costs are going to be preventative, and that cannot happen to a consumer direct. It's not a legal scenario, and in some markets, people make their way to duck and weave around the system and get it cleared, but it's not a strategy I think anyone would want to adopt for their business legally. The one company that's been doing a lot of work in that area of providing available products that people might see at cellar door, or in this case may pivot people to their online platform, is De Van, and there's others that specialize in other categories, but I think they've been one that has gone through Australia and try to really promote brand, and then essentially deliver a 6 or a 12 pack. That's basically, they run a club on your behalf of products that they can deliver to your house and your doorstep. And the idea originally would have been that, you travel, you visit the winery. By the time you return home, the case of wine is on your doorstep that you tasted, and you didn't have to carry it around in your suitcase. Given current times, I think they're probably pivoting as well. I haven't stayed up to date in the last few months with what they're doing.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. And I'll hand over. I'll move on to Blake Miller's question, and it's related with Andrea Pritzker's as well, where some beverage companies have adapted with the packaging sizes since COVID. So you've got beer and premix cans, bottle increases in size to 12 packs versus 6 packs of drinks. And I'll get Beck to answer this question based on your portfolio and what your principals are telling you. Is there a similar change to the size of the typical offering from wine? A variation on standard bottle sizes that you would recommend that they adopt at this point in time?
I would say, Damien, you know, part of this challenge that Kathy talked about is really the bottleneck with distributors. While we have a consumer base that are increasingly either, you know, looking to have different pack sizes, i.e. increasing trial of different types of wine, or single serve is also in growth, but we also have the very real challenge in the 3-tier system that it's a SKU game. You know, there's 115,000 SKUs every year approved by the TTB, and you don't get many good looks when you turn up at a distributor and tell them you'd like to add more wines to that list. I would say that certainly in traditional categories, Bordeaux, Champagne, Burgundy, you know, they've been at the kind of the half bottle game for decades. And, you know, again, it's something that's been more established, I think, in more traditional categories. And also, again, you have this price challenge, you know, in terms of pricing of half bottles, it's not half the price of a 750. And so there's a price premium in that format change. And so in our portfolio, the only halves that we have are in Champagne. And that's really it, because it's an established category. We have a demand for the product. And we know that we can turn that product within a 12-month period and won't be sitting on old inventory that gets just as expensive to carry as it does, you know, to have it out in the market on shelf.
Yeah, and interestingly, I'd just like to add to that as well with regard to the packaging. I mean, the large formats are the ones we're actually seeing a lot of movement in at the moment. And you've got some producers, an example, Creation Wines from South Africa. They're actually shipping their tasting packs to different people around the world. So producers are starting to show a bit of that innovation as a way to get around the challenges that are being faced. And consumers are either stockpiling or maybe wanting to try something new. So I think that's the comments made so far are certainly focused on that topic. I'll move to Piers Gorman's question here and turn to Justin on this one, because I think this is probably one that's more suited to you. Specifically, are you seeing any disruption to the B2B channel in Australia?
I've definitely seen, there's a couple of players in the market, and names escape me, but there's been one that's been in the industry for quite some time, maybe 5-6 years, and they've really struggled to get some traction in that. But there's another one that's just raised money recently to tackle this. And there's never been a better time for it. I just don't know. I've never seen it work successfully so far in terms of marketplace-driven kind of B2B play. You've got the challenge of these established distributed networks that you know, you need feet on the ground to build those relationships with the right kind of outlets. And then on the flip side of that, you know that is getting tougher, and you know that the market has shifted and it's accelerated down a different path. So yes, there are players attempting to do it. I haven't seen it work remarkably well yet, but if there's going to be a time for it, the time is now.
Thanks, Justin. I'll turn to Andreas. We're in the last 5 or so minutes of the session. We're doing our best to get through the questions as best we possibly can. So thanks very much for your attention to that. I wanted to turn to the concept of digital as probably a good topic to finish on with the discussion, Andreas. And what are you seeing, or what would you like to see, I guess? What do you see as the future of Wine Australia trying to get into the US and using the digital platform?
Well, you know, I think from our perspective, I mean, from a Wine Australia perspective, our strategy in the US is really threefold. It's one around that ongoing commercial engagement. and breaking down that bottleneck. Obviously, Kathy alluded to it before, both with that distributor network and the retailer. And as part of that, obviously, the wine.com as a principal player, we had a promotional opportunities with them last September with our big campaign now, and we've doubled back with them over May and June, and it's proved delivered some really great results. So that's fantastic. So obviously, with that, it's a traditional sort of bricks and mortar. Retail is continuing to thrive globally. We know that. People still want to drink during these tough times, thankfully, also always responsibly, of course. And I mean, what's in our favour is Australia's traditionally been strong in retail. We're probably under-indexed on premise. Ironically enough, that's probably is not impacting us as much now, given the decline of on premise. So that the digital as part of that commercial engagement is very strong. I've talked about the digital engagement through education as well. And then the last plank for us is the market entry. In a market like the US, when we were successful there, we had about 500 plus exporters who were very active in the market. That halved during the last 10 years. We need to bring people back to the market in a sustainable, credible fashion and connect them with the opportunity. As I said, you can't just sort of land there with a box of wine and hope you're going to sell it. We need to curate the opportunity and really build those connections. And with that, there's got to be a digital component to it, because I mean, a lot of what we've traditionally done is around visits as well. The sector's built itself on grabbing the hearts and minds, bringing people out to Australia. You see the regions, you immerse them, and you get in the heart, you get in the head, and they're your lifelong ambassadors. Now, when we'll be able to do that again, who knows? But you can't just sort of sit back and think, oh, okay, we're just going to wait until people can jump on a plane again. Clearly, we've got to be a bit more ambitious than that. So that's where everything's got a digital overlay to it and driving that connection. So yeah, we've got to interplay with everything that we're doing from a category perspective, which then works hand in glove, obviously, to what producers and exporters are doing as well.
Thanks for that, Andreas. And I'll turn to Kathy on this one, specifically because she's got a feet on the ground in the US market and looking after the interests of Australian producers. What do you see as being effective digital strategy that can help producers engage more effectively with the US consumer?
Well, I think the biggest, I was reading that as sort of the biggest challenge, and I think the biggest challenge is just being ready and equipped with the digital content in the right way to communicate. It's less about how it gets, to the consumer, how it supports. I think that, just from a distribution perspective, the business has always been fairly simple and protected in its simplicity in the United States. So there isn't a lot of sophistication in the digital arena. You look up any major or small distribution company's website, and until recently you would have struggled to get relevant content on those websites. I think everyone is rushing and racing to try and update them. The opportunity is to do it correctly and with thought about your consumer and the audience you're trying to reach, and to make sure you can get it into a number of different channels through digital in order to reach that consumer in a multifaceted approach. That would be, my biggest recommendation.
And Kathy, thanks for that. I'll turn over to Beck to make the final comments before I close things out. Beck, you wanted to add to that as we close out?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is, two things. One, nothing's perfect right now, so be courageous to try new things. We're seeing virtual reality. We're seeing people go on those tours. We have a producer from Argentina who made a VR app on their mobile device so that consumers could connect. Too early to tell whether it's got stickiness, but I would say, right now there isn't an answer, there isn't a framework. To Kathy's point, it's pretty rudimentary. So we're an innovative bunch as culturally. So let's start to put some of that, to use and really push the boundaries, because people are looking for new and interesting things always, particularly from Australia.
Well, thank you for that, to the panel and to everyone who's been online today. We'll certainly look over the questions and make a point of continuing the discussion to the best of our ability on our preferred platforms following this event. I would like to thank Andreas, Rebecca, Kathy and Justin for taking the time to present today. And on behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce, I would like to thank Adelaide Business School for their contribution and support to this initiative. Thank you everyone who joined us today, and make a point of please joining the second part 2 of the Business of Wine series that will be held here, same place, same time on the 28th of July. Thanks everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. I'm going to go and have a glass. Cheers.